Welcome to the special bonus episode of the Story Nerd Podcast. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill. I'm a writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
We're taking a break from theory today because offline, Melanie and I have been talking a lot about AI, us and everybody else, specifically the impact that artificial intelligence has and will have on us as writers. And we thought it might be a good idea to record our thoughts and share them with you. We're not claiming to have any answers here, and we sure don't have a crystal ball. I wish we did, but we've got plenty of questions. So, in the spirit of starting a conversation and perhaps adding our voices to a conversation that's already happening in our industry, here's what we have to say about AI, at least at this point in time. Melanie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, a couple of things have really caught my eye lately when it comes to the conversation around artificial intelligence. And, it's such a hot topic for debate. And some of the things like the recent resignation of Geoffrey Hinton, who is Google's godfather of AI, he left Google recently so that he could start to speak freely about the existential threat that AI poses for humanity. So that's a pretty big thing, and it really piqued my interest. The other things that have come to my attention or into my field of view recently was that an AI-generated image won first place in the Sony World Photography Award competition. And the photographer, Boris Elgerson, who submitted the image, turned the prize down because he wanted to start a conversation about AI-generated content. Eldgerson rightly pointed out that what he entered was not a photograph because it wasn't a picture taken with a camera, but it is art. So the picture was generated by him using his own recipe of prompts. So he, with the assistance of the AI generation tool, created a photo or an image. Now, there obviously is some sort of creative process involved in the generation of this image. However, I would argue that you can tell the image is artificially generated. Now, there is something about it, if you've ever seen it, that looks not quite real. And I think it's in the eyes, to be honest with you. I think there's something really missing in the eyes of that image. Now, this was also interesting to me because a few months ago, as part of my family's ongoing love of Middle-earth, we sat down and watched The Rings of Power. Now, the settings were sumptuous and the characters looked like the younger versions of the ones we came to love in Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. But to me, there was something that was not quite right about it. Now, as the conversations often go in my family, when I point out story problems or ask questions about the plot, the character, or the structure, there's a whole lot of groaning and eye rolling. And my husband recently told me that I've ruined less than perfect movies for him because he can now see the flaws. And I'm pretty sure that my kids feel the same way too. But when I stumbled across an article on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's website that suggested the Rings of Power script was written by AI, the doubts I had about the series started to make sense to me. And my brain started to flick back over to the mental notes I'd made about the characters, the events, and particularly the dialogue. So there are so many scenes that didn't make sense to me in the series because there was something incredibly illogical about them. But it really was in the dialogue where I started to sense things were odd because it was, for want of better words, it was unrelational. So you couldn't form a connection with the words that were being said by the actors. Now, I know unrelational is not really a word, but what I'm trying to say, I think, is that there was no real cause and effect of the dialogue. There was no listening or searching for meaning between the characters, and it just was not right. So compared to Tolkien's book, and Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, which I think captures the essence of what it means to be human. And also, there's a fundamental truth about the human experience in times of existential conflict. The Rings of Power really did sound like a plastic version of an epic story. Now, I'll just pause there for a minute. Valerie, have you seen The Rings of Power, or have you read anything about that you wanted to add in terms of how to detect AI generated dialogue or writing?
I have not seen it, but I have read articles about it. And what you're saying is ringing true. Now, I had a similar experience this past week. I was listening to Seth Godin's podcast, Akimbo, and he's got a couple of episodes about AI. So I listened to those. And in the first episode, it's a two-parter. So in the first episode, Seth is asking questions, commonly asked questions about AI, and he's answering them. And in the second part, it's more of an opinion piece. So when I listen to Seth Godin's podcast, I listen to it all in one go, and he has no trouble keeping my attention for the 20 or 30 minutes of an episode. This time, though, when I was listening to part one, I stopped it twice. So it took me 3 separate listening sessions to get through the whole thing. I wasn't engaged by it, and I thought, oh, well, maybe it's the topic. Maybe I'm really not that interested in AI after all. And then I thought, well, no, I think it's his delivery. He sounds really bored. I thought, well, maybe he's having an off day. He's allowed to have an off day. But it's the only time I have ever stopped any of his podcasts, even once, let alone twice. Now, spoiler alert, in the second part of the Akimbo podcast, Seth says, I think it's at the end of the first part, isn't it? Yeah, at the end of the first part, the very end, he says, oh, by the way, that wasn't me writing those words or reading those words. That was AI. It was like a sampling of his voice. And I thought, that's what I was picking up on. There was no emotion in what he was saying. And if you listen to any of his podcasts, he loves what he does, and it shows in the energy with which he delivers his content, in the intonation of his voice, and the way he phrases his sentences, all that stuff. None of that was there. It was flat, and it was quite dull. It was monotone. It didn't have the Seth Godin spark. The sentences were phrased the way Seth writes. The voice certainly sounded like Seth. It had me fooled, but yet it wasn't Seth. And I was intuitively picking up on that, even though I had no idea that it was AI. I just thought he's off. This is not his normal performance. So when you and your family were watching The Rings of Power, I'm not at all surprised to hear that your spidey senses were tingling, and that something about it, even though you didn't know at the time that it is potentially AI generated, something about it wasn't ringing true to you. So it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that at all.
Yeah, and I don't think it generally, again, it looked right, and the actors were human actors, but there were some really things that were quite off about it, or things that just didn't seem to make sense, which actually led me down another rabbit hole of how do you tell if something is generated by AI, from a writer's point of view. Now, and this led me to some really interesting things, and I'm sure that this will be very time-based, right? So as time moves on, you may not be able to tell AI-generated content compared to this point in time, but it's worthwhile thinking about, I think. So one of the signs, and this occurs in the Rings of Power, is a short memory. So, for example, when the halflings in the Rings of Power clearly state that they do not leave anyone behind. And this is presented as a fundamental principle that underpins their nomadic life. And then a quarter of the way through, the halflings leave a whole family behind to fend for themselves. Now, later, there are more references to not leaving anyone behind in the story as well. But it seems like this is really indicative of that short memory or that inconsistent memory from a storytelling perspective. And there are other examples of this type, again, in the series, including the random appearances of the three witches, from the land of Rune. And they are really a bit odd. The dialogue is also another giveaway, right? It sounds like Tolkien, but it's meaningless. So if you watch the first 2 episodes, you'll see what I mean. And here's an example that's said in by 2 Elvish characters. And I quote, "Do you know why the ship floats and the stone does not? It's because the stone sees only downwards." Now, I ask you, what does that even mean? So a stone can't see, and not even the wisdom of an elf can make that line work. Right? Even if you're talking in metaphor, it still does not work. So there is a lack of consistency in the world as well, and clearly a lack of memory about the rules of the world. Now, I think AI-generated content, especially writing content, will be cheap and it will take next to no time to create, right? And sure, there will be some who are very keen to produce fast and easy content. But I ask you as a reader, is that going to be worthy of your time? And in my mind, it's not always. Because I start to think about AI-generated content like McDonald's, right? It's a McDonald's meal compared to a home-cooked meal or a Sunday roast. So sure, there's a time and a place to have a quick and easy meal, but does it contain the same nutrition as a home-cooked meal? And was it made with love? And I think the answer is quite clearly no. So nothing, I think, will ever replace a home-cooked meal. And I think it's the same with art created by humans. And Sonia Alexander recently wrote in an article from Script Magazine, and I quote, Friedrich Nietzsche is quoted as saying, "Art is life's metaphysical exercise. Art appeals to the mind, body, and soul. It is a tangible representation of the spirit." End quote. Now, I firmly believe in, and more importantly, enjoy the act or the art of creation. And as an artist, creation comes before putting art out for people to read or review. Now, whether they like it has always been a matter of taste, right? So now I use some form of AI to support tools for grammar and punctuation, when I'm editing. But after a while, it really does become abundantly clear that these programs don't support a writer's voice or their turns of phrase or the nuances in the language, such as a dialect or cultural differences. So it's then, as an editor, up to me to override or ignore the recommendations of these tools, and especially when they don't support the stylistic choices the artist is making, or they actually reduce the meaning of what's been written. Now, don't get me wrong, these are handy tools, but I also start to wonder about how homogenous they will make writing if people don't use their discretion. Now, I've just turned off one part of a program because it kept recommending North American spellings to me. And as an Australian, I will always use the English or Australian spellings of words. Now, to me, this is a matter of principle and the preservation of my language and also my culture. And this is important. And again, it speaks to the homogenization point that I make. Now, AI does offer advantages in relation to crunching large amounts of data and drawing from it. But that too is not without its problems. Large data can mean that it includes all data, or maybe it doesn't. So, but here's a really good example from a book I read recently about understanding what sort of data you're using when you are looking at answers that you're given. So for, an example, Seatbelt data may tell you that if you're wearing a seatbelt in an accident, it will decrease your chance of injury by 60%, and it may reduce your chances of fatal injury by 30%. However, when seatbelts were introduced, they were only tested on adult men. So the data is skewed and incomplete for children and women. So the analysis of seatbelt effectiveness changes if a more complete data set is added. So it's worth noting that seatbelt effectiveness is dependent also upon the speed a car is travelling at the time of impact. Now, I'm not saying that people should not wear seatbelts. That's not true at all. But they obviously save lives. But what I'm saying is that you need to understand the data set, and you need to understand what it does and does not include. Now, depending on the data source, it may be skewed with biases such as confirmation bias and Simpson's paradox, which is where combining data sets creates a result that is the opposite of what's really happening. Now, you can see I'm a bit of a data nerd. I work with data. So I understand some of these things, or these are the things that I start to look for, right? So these issues exist in the AI creation tools too. So the answers you get from AI will be dependent upon the data that is used. So I'd also be hesitant to assume that you are going to get the right answer as well when you ask a question. Now, a friend of mine who listens to the podcast asked ChatGTP about story structure in McKee's book Story. Now, the answer included a type of structure it called fuzzy structure, and that is not in McKee's book. So story nerds like Valerie and I know this because we've read the book, right? So don't always assume that an AI tool will give you the right answer. And I also recently had a conversation with a client about the pros and cons of using AI to help them write by using writing prompts. And my client was rightly worried, like a lot of us are, about whether or not that's cheating. Now, I think there is a big difference between using a tool to help with writing prompts compared to generating a whole story, a script, or an article using AI and then passing it off as your own. To me, that's not writing. That's like the artist who generated the image that won the Sony World Photography Prize. And perhaps it's like an AI-generated script for TV content. There's something not quite right about it. But getting a bit of help to start the creative process seems to me to be okay. Now, being creative and sharing the human experience, I think, is essential to our survival and to our collective knowledge building. Sure, it's okay to use AI tools, but as for a whole AI-generated content, it's not the same as human-generated content. Give me a home-cooked meal any day. Now, it will be up to us as content consumers and content creators to keep humans front and center when we make decisions about what we read or watch, especially when we consider that stories program the way we think about the world. And Valerie and I always go back to the quote from Lisa Crone's Wired for Story. And quote, she says, "Story is what makes us human, not just metaphorically, but literally. Recent breakthroughs in neuroscience reveal that our brain is hardwired to respond to story. The pleasure we derive from a tale well told is nature's way of seducing us into paying attention to it. In other words, we are wired to turn to story to teach us the ways of the world," unquote. And I'll just leave you with a question of, do you really want AI to teach you the way of the world? Valerie, what do you think? What's your answer to that question?
Hell no.
It's probably the same as mine.
Okay, so like so many of you, I've been trying to educate myself about AI and how it might impact my job and my life in general. None of us has a crystal ball, unfortunately, but there are an awful lot of knowledgeable people saying many of the same things. Now, Melanie, you mentioned Geoffrey Hinton, and I've been watching a lot of YouTube interviews with him. For those who haven't heard of him before, as Melanie said, he's known as the godfather of AI. And he left his job at Google so he could speak freely about AI and what's coming so that we can prepare ourselves. It really is worth your time to listen to his interviews and to what he has to say. What he and many others have said basically is this: AI is neither good nor bad, it just is. It will help us in many ways we can't begin to imagine, and medical breakthroughs are often cited. But there will be bad players who use AI for nefarious purposes, and we have absolutely no checks and balances in place to protect us. And as authors, I'm thinking about issues like copyright and IP and all that kind of stuff. They also say that AI will change everything. It'll be bigger than the internet, bigger than the personal computer, and even bigger than electricity. The last thing they say is that AI is already here. It's getting bigger and better every single day. So let me just focus on AI and how it impacts us as writers. From everything I've learned so far, it seems to me that at some point in the not too distant future, AI will be able to generate something that passes for a story. Now, as we record today, it can't. Melanie, we already talked about the Rings of Power and how wonky it is. I recently watched the film 80 for Brady, and it's equally wonky. In fact, it's downright bizarre. It doesn't make any sense. Now, I cannot find any evidence that it was written by AI, but I doubt that they'd advertise that anyway. If it wasn't generated by AI, then it's the type of thing that AI is coming up with at the moment. It's really weird. In saying this, I firmly believe that these kinds of logic problems will eventually get worked out. And when it does, it's going to be a problem for anyone whose current business model requires them to write a book a month or 6 books in a year. And I want to be clear here, I am not making a value judgment on any author following this model. No matter how good you are or how fast you can write, a computer will be faster. Writing speed isn't something that humans can compete on. Quantity is not something we can compete on. However, when it comes to quality, my instinct is telling me that humans have the potential to win every single time. Now, I'm no expert in AI, so I have been listening to people who are experts in the hopes of finding some kind of an answer to this. And not surprisingly, the clearest and most succinct answer I found is from Seth Godin. And here's what he said: if you're a mediocre creative, you should get out. AI is coming for you any minute. On the other hand, extraordinary, off-the-charts, unpredictable, remarkable work, that's going to be really hard for AI to do. It always has been. The race is on for you to stop trying to please a mediocre audience. We require people to challenge us to go to a place where a computer can never get. We can't just keep filling in little tiny gaps. We've got to make big leaps to do work that matters for people who care. So, mediocre writers are in trouble. But at some point in our careers, we're all mediocre. So, what do we do? Well, the challenge that's before us now, before all of us now, is to write stories that are extraordinary, off the charts, unpredictable, and remarkable. Like, there is no phoning it in anymore. We have got to write to the edges of our ability all of the time, and we've got to constantly be improving our ability. AI will soon be able to string words together in a way that makes sense, but it will never be able to write an innovative story that teaches us something about what it means to be human. Art is an expression of the human spirit, and AI will never have that. So what does that mean? Well, my guess is that an already flooded marketplace will be inundated by AI generated books. There are some that already exist, but an AI generated book can only be copies of stories we've all seen and heard before. I think as we move forward, that the divide between the really, truly great novels and all the rest will get wider. I think that's true of every industry. The rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer. I think that any writer who wants to stay in the game, frankly, is going to have to level up their craft, no matter what our current writing level is, no matter how good we are right now, no matter what our current understanding of the craft is. We've got to get better, because if an AI can do our job, it will do our job. Now, because I believe that AI is neither good nor bad, it depends on how we use it, it's entirely possible that there are or will be AI tools that help us get better. So I'm curious to know more about that. I'm keeping an open mind. The danger, though, is that it can make us lazy. I'm already seeing it. When my kids were coming up through grade school, they weren't taught how to spell. I'm not even joking. I will try not to get upset because it's still a trigger point for me. My kids were taught how to use spell check. And when I made inquiries, the school's computers were set to American English, like US, United States of America English, not Canadian English. So, I mean, my kids were spelling favor, F-A-V-O-R, and it was driving me right out of my mind. I'm very attached to my U's. Melanie, as you said, it's a whole cultural thing, right?
Absolutely. I'm attached to my S's and not Z's as well. So, I understand that completely. And these are the many things that worry me about those kind of programs. And that's just a word program. Like, that's not even anything other than that's intelligent, right? But
that's just spelling.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I mean, the kids were also taught how to use the calculator on their iPhones rather than, learning how to do simple math in their heads. So listen, you can imagine the arguments that were going on in my household when I gave the kids spelling lists and made them learn their times tables. There's a terrific article in the June 2nd, 2023 edition of Publishers Weekly. It's called AI is About to Turn Book Publishing Upside Down, and it's written by Thad McElroy. It touches on every single aspect of our industry. And while I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, it's certainly food for thought. So go check that out when you have a minute. There's more information on Joanna Penn's podcast and website. Ally's website has a bunch of information. And Jay Thorne has just started a newsletter called Creative AI Digest. So I encourage you to check out all of those resources. And as always, I recommend Seth Godin. Now, I think that whatever our writing goals are, we've got to make informed decisions about the craft, about the marketplace, about everything. We've got to make sure that AI is a tool that serves us and that we're not somehow becoming a slave to AI. We're not using it to cut corners, and we're not allowing it to make us lazy. At the moment, we can tell the difference between AI-generated art, whether it's photos, stories, podcasts, or films, and those created by a human. But I'm wondering how much longer that's going to last. Not long. I'm thinking it's months, not years. And if the market does become inundated by books that meet the minimum viable product standard that so many publishers go by, and that so many indie authors accept from themselves, honestly, the demand for truly amazing stories is going to go way up. So what's the bottom line here? Well, I can only speak for myself, but I'm placing my faith in Seth Godin. I mean, he hasn't led me astray yet. I cannot be a mediocre creative because AI will wipe me out. It'll take me out of business. And if you're a mediocre creative, it's going to wipe you out too. However, AI might benefit us, and it might enable us to run our author businesses. But at the same time, it's forcing us to become better storytellers. We don't have a choice anymore. We've got to write books that are innovative, that are extraordinary, that are off the charts, that are unpredictable, and that are remarkable.
So what we're saying really is be interested. Be very interested as creatives about what's happening, because it is going to impact us in some way or another. And it is a constantly changing field. But if I can leave you with, one thought is, or two thoughts really, is one, be interested. And secondly, understand the data sources and understand that that's what AI works off. And if you can question that, and if you can keep that in the back of the mind, I don't think you'll go very far wrong. All right, that wraps up this episode of the Story Nerd podcast, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And if you'd like to find out about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.